So I found the random suffix that it was using, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 characters. And it is exactly 1 character too long than what it needs to be to validate. Hi, my name is Julie. I'm an engineer at Microsoft, and I want to show you today how I would and do deploy and manage 3 different Kubernetes clusters for dev, staging, and production using a combination of Terraform and Makefiles. I just wanted to show you kind of like how to do this nicely, and I'm also throwing in all these sort of Azure add-ins like Azure AD pod identity and installing the CSI driver, etc. I did this yesterday, and then I realized, I kind of just jump into things, and I've been listening to your feedback in the comments and a few of you who wrote via email that it's hard to follow like kind of end to end, and if you're trying to learn things. So this morning, because I couldn't sleep, and it was 6:30 in the morning, I decided to actually put together a small PowerPoint, even though I hate PowerPoint, to explain that. So in the first sort of few minutes of this video, I just want to give you that sort of context and that understanding. And if you want to, again, watch me sort of fumble through real life engineering and little sort of errors that pop up and why something doesn't work. You can watch the rest of that afterwards. Okay, so this is something that I'm actually building up towards, which is going to be a multi-tenant Kubernetes cluster for various sort of demos that I build that right now are deployed in various places. It's a work in progress. I actually haven't done a lot of Kubernetes in the last 6 to 8 months, so a lot of that's kind of gone. I'm just trying to bring that back in. What I want to do is basically right now use this as a demo to teach people how to do sort of DevOps, and especially knowing that it's 2 different things if you're talking about applications and infrastructure. So this slide is from a talk that I gave at DevOps.js, and more important is actually this sort of slide. So there are various sort of layers, right? And you have something in the middle that sometimes multiple infrastructure as code repositories or even DevOps pipelines might touch. And what's really important to understand is basically which infrastructure as code repository owns this resource, as well as who are the people that own this resource. And so what we're going to focus on today is actually that middle layer, right? So this is the one that bootstraps sort of the clusters. I want to point out that I decided to sort of optimize the deployment of this, not just with code, but because I want to do 3, right? I want to do dev, staging, and prod. And I don't like Bash so much. I can write some of it, right? But it's just sort of like unwieldy. And the biggest challenge actually when you're managing 3 different clusters is all the different parameters you have to put into it. My goal was to basically do this in 5 commands, and this is done more or less in 5 commands, right? So I have the 3 Terraform commands I need to do to actually deploy the infrastructure and also manage configuration. And then I'm actually just going to set the whole thing up. So install all the Azure add-ins like the pod identity, the CSI driver, and I'm also going to hook up the ingress controller to grab TLS certificates as well. And that's all done with that make setup command. Super easy, super nice. And if I was creating a pipeline for this, this is what it would look like. The other thing to note is sort of how is this going to work? I have 1 infrastructure as code repository. Check out the description below for the link to it. And while you're down there, please like and subscribe. What I would do is actually have 3 different branches, right? So I'm using the branches on the one hand to target kind of like I want to do, deployment to staging, or rather I want to configure the staging Kubernetes cluster. The other reason for doing that is that I have in this repository just 1 Terraform module, a custom module that I've made. And when I'm making changes that I want to sort of quote unquote promote, I will have to basically move them into the different branches. This is not going to be published. It's not going to be a module that I version and sort of pull in. It's all going to stay in here. So what this looks like, right? I said, Terraform init, plan, and apply. So there's a little bit of configuration that you have to do. Terraform state files, right, which I'll talk about in a second in detail. But so that Terraform knows what's going on with your infrastructure, if it needs to make changes or remove it, it has a state file. I have to tell it where to find that state file, which is actually stored remotely on Azure. So the configuration, the name of the storage account, token, etc., to access it, that I have to feed that into it so that it knows which cluster I want to talk to. The other thing is that I have to pass in the variables so that it knows like, okay, this is the name I gave the cluster, etc. And I have to tell it that when I do the plan. When I do the apply, I don't have to feed it anything, because in the plan step, I'm making actually a plan, which I think is a binary file that comes out, that it just applies. And then the kube context and the setup make script, I will show you that in a second, why there's no variables for that. So one note about the Terraform state. So you might think, oh, I have 3 different clusters, 3 different deployment targets. I have 3 different state files and 3 storage accounts. No. So remember, I'm using this repository as well as a teaching tool. What you want to do is actually slice it by your security boundaries, right? So what you often see in organizations is that you would see multiple actors, right? And you might only just distinguish between production and non-production. So people who have elevated privileges have access to production. And this also applies to service principals, which you see kind of below. And so because we're not distinguishing by deployment targets, right, we're distinguishing by the security boundaries, then I only need 2 storage accounts. This is an important detail, because if you're a really large enterprise and you're like just creating all these like storage accounts, there's a limit per region, per subscription. You don't want to hit that, right? And I want you to think about the choices you're making to fully understand why you're making them, which actually just means you're understanding your business requirements and security requirements more than just, oh, I'm learning Azure. I want you to learn cloud, not Azure. Well, both. Okay. So the other configuration, right? I'm not going to show the backend one, but the other configuration you want to do is the Terraform bits. And so you'll see that I have a defaults.auto.tf-vars. And so those are automatically loaded and I don't have to change anything, right? What you often see is that, okay, the VM size, you might have, a smaller VM SKU. You don't need a lot of performance for development because it's actually not taking production traffic. And then there are variable files per deployment target, right? So the example here I have is staging. And then you will, and I notice I put in dev, copy and paste, right? So that should say dev.tf-vars. Anyway, you can set the things like host names and the environment as you need it. And this is how I would actually also test then upgrades of Kubernetes clusters versions. You see there's a default in there, and I can actually pass in a different value if I want to. So how does this actually get absorbed by the bash foo that I call, that's actually now hidden in a Makefile? So inside the Makefile, you can actually have various scripts, right? So this is sort of fake code. It doesn't exactly say this, but there are 3 parts to the example line in this script, right? So I have a cat of a YAML, which means I'm going to output that entire YAML, right? I'll show the YAML in a second, but there are variables that are going to be filled in, and that's what the subst, or substitute environment variables command does. So the cat is piped into the events subst. So then after that, I have a YAML with all the values. And then that is given to the kubectl to actually basically, create those resources. I'm doing this because remember, I'm doing 3 clusters, not 1, 3. So this is what the YAML kind of looks like, right? There's a syntax, right, to use the curly braces, and that is this is what it looks like. So the reason why the Ingress managed identity, right, is a variable is that obviously security, I have different identities per deployment target, right? You don't want your dev environment Ingress able to pull the production TLS certificate. So that's kind of how things are a bit wired. I'm just using this as an example. Some of the other YAMLs, if you look in the repository, are a bit nastier just because it's harder to config. And yes, pod identity, and yes, CSI drivers is hard, but you chose to use Kubernetes. Kubernetes is hard. What did you expect? Okay, so the magic, right, where everything comes together. How do you get all those environment variables? So near the top of the Makefile, what you'll find is a section called Export All Variables. And this is where I set all the environment variables. And what is beautiful about this that I love is that there is a Terraform output, right, which gives a structure that I define, right? So this whole AKS cluster, Ingress manage identity name, I made that, right? One of my to-dos for this week is I need to figure out how Bicep handles that. So Azure Bicep does that. Because with R, my understanding is that you get this raw JSON that you have to process, and there's all this crap in there that I don't want and I don't care about because I'm not a robot. I'm a human. I don't want to read JavaScript object notation. So sorry that I said crap. Anyway, so there is a little bit of filtering that you have to go in and do, but you can look in the Makefile and you'll see that how all the variables are set. Now, the reason why this is a little bit magic in terms of environments is that if you remember, when I talk to Terraform, I give it those variables. I'm telling it, hey, I'm working with the staging cluster right now. Hey, I'm working with the dev cluster right now. So after I've sort of set the Terraform context, right? When I run these Terraform output commands, I get the one for the context that I'm in. So I kind of just set that once in Terraform. And the same thing, the make cube context, guess what? It just grabs the cube context so that you can actually work with the cluster. Super easy. This is why I love Terraform and Makefiles, because I'm pedantic. So what does this actually look like, right? And this is why the video actually took like 30 minutes instead of like 5 as I thought it was going to take. So I already talked about how you pass in the config and the var file. And then I went straight to do a cube context and set up. And I was like, why is this not working, right? And the reason why it's not working is if you remember that graphic that I showed you with the different layers, right? I'm working in the middle layer. There is a bottom layer that has the sort of centrally managed infrastructure, right? Which in my case is called the shared resource group. And the reason why this is different is that if you think about it, certificates like this, they have their own life cycle. These clusters, I'm planning on screwing up every now and then and just tearing down the entire, hopefully not production, but the staging and development environments and bringing that back up. I don't want to be constantly like destroying and bringing back up certificates, right? And in real life, there's another team managing that, and that is very stable. So that is done in another infrastructure as code repository, and the role assignments are also created in that repository. Because these names are also fixed in terms of the TLS certificate names, right? I don't add a suffix onto that to meet some resource names have to be a globally unique requirement. However, right? So again, I'm trying to teach you to think, right? Who owns that role assignment, right? So RBAC, role-based access control, has to do again with security. And if you think about it, in this shared resource group, they own that certificate. They own the RBAC, right? So me building this, right? I happen to be the one actor like doing everything. But in terms of how you're putting, you're dividing your code and how you're dividing the repositories, right? So my talk was about mono repos versus hybrid, etc. You decide based on who owns it, right? And that role assignment, the repository that I'm working on in this video, they don't own it. The central IT team in this graphic that manages the other infrastructure as code repository, they own it, and that's why it's there. Okay, I think the last thing I should mention, and you should watch the video for this reason, is that I had to run into that error, right, in order to be able to fix it. And then you'll see like, oh crap. And then I use K9s or K9s. If you've never used it, it's the best tool ever to manage Kubernetes clusters, to see all the services, controllers, pods, etc. running, to shell in, to see the logs. And literally, as soon as I opened K9s, I think within like 30 seconds or 1 minute, I saw the problem. I realized, the role assignment. So check it out for that if you're interested as well. I could eventually later do another video about K9s. So yeah, enjoy. So before I run this code, just to illustrate what this looks like, I'm in Visual Studio Code now, and you see I have the dev backend configuration and the staging backend configuration for the state file. I have the same storage account name, which is CloudCube TF state dev. The container name is the same. What is different is basically the file name, right? So cluster dev TF state, cluster staging TF state. So you know me, I'm all about security. I don't use storage account keys. I use SAS tokens. So I don't care if they end up on the screen, and then I don't have to worry about blurring them out, etc. So let's pick one that expires in 1 hour. And yes. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm actually going to put this in both because they're in the same storage account. I am definitely not going to be able to publish this video in an hour. Okay, so now I've switched back. Let's try instead to actually just deploy the staging cluster, which actually does not exist yet. So if you look at the resource groups that I have, I have the dev one, but I don't have the staging cluster yet. So I think I did set up staging backend. I did the same token that's valid for 1 hour, so I don't care if you see it. Let's do the staging TFRs. Okay, that is empty, so let me grab the dev TFRs and lovely copy and paste. So I'm gonna call this staging. The environment name is staging, and I'm going to make this also staging. Let's see, the key vault name is actually also called staging. Let me just double check. Yes, so this is in this repository that's managed in my fake example use case by a different infrastructure team, but definitely still a different infrastructure as code repository. So the ownership of that resource is elsewhere. And judging by the diagram, which doesn't have the exact names, but it's called staging key vault. So I have to change that as well. It is in the shared resource group. This will probably cause problems later if they have the same address space, but I don't know how to calculate addresses. So let's just ignore that for now. I just want to deploy this and see if it works. So let's try that again. So we need to init backend config and is backends staging.backend.hcl. Let's see if it works or if it grabs some old stuff from the cache. It does not. So let's do the plan. var file is environments and staging.tf_vars, if I remember correctly. Yes. And out and not O, so plan. So let's see what this does. So just a reminder, right? So the plan will basically give me a preview of what it's going to do. Terraform will say, hey, I'm going to do this. I'm going to create this resource group. I'm going to create this key vault. I'm going to create this like Kubernetes cluster, etc. As you can see here, and you can kind of just verify, all right, is it doing what I expect it to do? Because this is new, it's not going to destroy anything. It's just going to add a bunch of stuff. So I'm not too worried about that. So I'm going to say, yes, please do that. I think this is actually going to take a while to create. Key vaults generally take a while to create as well, and so I'm wondering what I could talk about as this like creates. Okay, Terraform did not finish deploying it. I just noticed in my line of sight that it stopped, and there was an error. And so I found the random suffix that it was using, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 characters. And it is exactly 1 character too long than what it needs to be to validate. So, yeah. So I need to figure out what I'm going to do now. Okay, it finished in 6 minutes and 43 seconds, and I kind of didn't notice. Oh well. So let's go back and remember I said, what am I going to do? And then I decided to do this. Because of the way I coded this with the random string, I don't want it to destroy the dev cluster. So instead, I'm creating a local variable. And if it is not set, it's going to use this. Otherwise, it will use whatever variable it is. The defaults here is actually an empty string. And if I come over here to, sorry, that's not where I wanted to go. This is why I don't click, because I actually have no idea what I'm clicking, and it's the wrong thing. So I've decided to use a 3-character suffix, and I'm just keeping the old one, which was OD7C, and it just dropped the O because it looks like a 0 sometimes. So D7C, can't screw that up. Anyway, let's just run this again just to make sure it works. We're gonna set the cube context. And then we will run make setup. Okay, and you'll see that I'm going to use more colors with backgrounds to indicate just sort of like, okay, am I doing Kubernetes namespaces? It's create. This is in yellow. I'll show it a little bit maybe where I remove something. It's going to be in red. Azure CSI, blue for Azure. It's going to run the Helm install right now. The nice thing about this is that I don't have to know all the bash through. I've put it in sort of like one file. And the colors, right? I want to be able to understand something without actually having to read something, right? It gives you sort of context. And so purple for Kubernetes, blue for Azure related stuff, yellow for kind of like, I'm doing something. And just so that I know, okay, it's kubectl apply, is it a Helm? And then I'll show in a second when I change something or remove something, it's going to be in red. Yeah, my terminal, or iterm here, will also tell me how long all of this takes. But again, here it's not just the remembering the bash scripts, it's also replacing all those variables in the YAML files, right, with actual environment variables which actually come from Terraform. And the really nice thing is literally I can fire all of this up, and let's hope this works, and using conventions, and it should just kind of work. This is the other repository with all the shared infra. So let's wait for this, I guess, to finish. No, not working. So it failed at apply hello. Okay, so let's debug this. I normally have multiple screens, but because I'm recording, I'm just going to use this one. I use this awesome tool called K9s instead of K8s for Kubernetes, so I can see everything. Let's see all the pods. And you can see that this one is failing for some reason, so let's go take a look at why it's failing. It's not showing any logs, so let's do describe, and you'll see the errors here. Yes, I know exactly what this is doing. So I need to create the role assignments, and that is in the shared resource group because that is owned by the shared resource group. So yeah, this is failing because it can't grab the TLS certificates to be mounted, duh. So let's get out of this. I already know how to fix this. Okay, so now I'm in the shared info repository, and this one's actually already open source. And you'll see here that, let me see if I can open this. Okay, so I'm making this larger. So everything in this resource group is owned by this infrastructure as code repository. However, it does need to know the identities, the managed identities, to which I'm going to give access to these particular key vaults. So if I go back, there is a file here, and I basically have to set this for staging, which I hadn't set, which is why it wasn't working. So let's go back to this repository, and it was in, remember, I can't click because I don't know how that works. So I need to change this to staging. Okay, staging, and because the conventions are the same, this is going to be, if I remember, 7DC or something like that. D7C, so not 7DC. Okay, so that's finished after about 35 seconds. Let's see what this is doing. Where's my other window? Oh, I have lots of windows. This one. So let's see if Kubernetes is still trying to create them. Yes, I didn't even have to do anything. I swear I didn't do it. So I hope this is helpful, showing you how pedantic I am, but maybe also the benefits of putting in that extra time, right? So that you can manage multiple instances of something and yeah, do it in production. This is an audio outro because I don't want to delay publishing this video any longer. If you like this, if it was helpful, please let me know in the comments below. Please like and subscribe. It really does help because then I can, try to carve out more time in my schedule to make these for you. And when I say schedule, I mean working schedule. As spring and summer comes along, it's going to be more challenging to do these. All right, so help me out, like and subscribe, and see you soon.